Hello everybody, my name is Christian Swenson. I do videos here on YouTube about autism, autistic consciousness, and life on the autism spectrum. Now, if you're a human in the modern world, you have probably either heard, read, or listened to or seen a version of the Ugly Duckling. You know, the ugly duckling, the little swanling that's in the middle of the ducklings. It thinks it's ugly, but it's actually just a swan. It isn't deficient, it's just different. That is a fairy tale, but it's not an old fairy tale. It's not even 200 years old. It was composed at a single time, unlike most other fairy tales, by an author, this guy, Hans Christian Andersen, who lived in Copenhagen in like the mid-19th century, Denmark. I have written here Kierkegaard from an earlier take. Kierkegaard was another Danish citizen from that time. He was Andersen's contemporary and rival. A famous philosopher, you've probably heard of him, technically pronounced Kierkegaard. But why am I talking about Andersen? Well, first of all, if you're autistic, you'll probably really resonate with the Ugly Duckling, and that's on purpose. That's not an accident. Secondly, the reason why that's not an accident is I'm pretty sure Mr. Andersen here was autistic. He was on the spectrum. And I'm going to give you some evidence why that's the case. I really want to. I've been to his tombstone in Copenhagen, also this guy's. And my ancestors, Mormon pioneers, left Denmark at exactly around this time, like 1850. So really tied into this whole scene here with my blood and my bones. And also it's just really interesting. This is my name, and then this is my wife's maiden name if you translate it to the Swedish version. Hans Christian Andersen was awkward. That's the first thing you should know. He kind of didn't know when to stop talking about himself. He once, when he was 14, auditioned at the house of a famous ballerina, and he couldn't dance, and it didn't go well. And let's see where I'm going to see if I can find the description that the ballerina gives of it. Yeah, the Copenhagen ballerina Anna Margrethe Schall described his capering steps and his improvised tambourine playing and described how they were so bizarre that the husband thought he was a lunatic and had him thrown out. So that's really important, by the way. I'll get into that. This is from a paper I wrote. I wrote a rather good paper, I'm told, about Hans Christian Andersen in grad school. They want me to publish it. I haven't done it yet. I'm getting on it. Just have to find out where. But Andersen was not a dancer because he wasn't embodied. He was dissociated. He wasn't an integrated personality. He couldn't figure out the right relationship between him and the world. And if you remember the Ugly Duckling story, the whole thing is about not being able to relate rightly to your environment. And more personally, it's also about misreading oneself, misinterpreting oneself in light of the environment. The duckling, in this case, is not a duckling. You're misreading this bird as an ugly duckling. He's a pretty swan. He's not an ugly duckling. And if everyone starts thinking that this is an ugly duckling, they're going to be mistaken. It's a misinterpretation of the symptoms. It's a misinterpretation in light of a toxic environment. Or just a different environment. He's not deficient. He's just different. And you can kind of tell that Andersen, when he's writing this story, I have my collected anthology right here. When he's writing this story and others, he's trying to figure out who he is, and he's trying to figure out where he fits. And, you see that in the Little Mermaid, too, right? She doesn't belong. Something's not right, in the Disney adaptation, I mentioned this before, she wants to be part of your world, not this world. It's the duckling-swan dichotomy, and I know the Disney movie's not like the fairy tale, but similar themes. But there's other things, too. Kierkegaard, like I said, he was Andersen's rival, wrote an entire treatise about Andersen critiquing him early. It's one of the first things he wrote and had published. And it's called Papers of One Still Living. and is basically critiquing Andersen and saying that he didn't have what Kierkegaard called a life view. In other words, he didn't have an integrated personality. He didn't win his experiences from life. He didn't wage war against life and win his personality. And that's because as autistic people, I would wager, we aren't really distinct from the world. We're kind of floating together with it, so to speak. Self and other merge. And that kind of makes you feel awkward and out of place, right? Like the ugly duckling. But it's also kind of like water, isn't it? You know? Water, autism, I need to do a video about this. Autism has everything to do with water. I've seen autistic writers write about that. And you know, the idea of the Little Mermaid being a water being and wanting to be on the surface is very important. And also, you know, the duckling and the swan. But what you see in Andersen is a preoccupation with inanimate objects as well. And they're not just inanimate objects, they're inanimate objects that have come to life. They have personalities, they have faces. And what we see there is the autistic tendency to ignore the difference between people and things. Right? When I was a kid, I would draw faces on all the furniture in the house with a permanent marker. Some of them are still there. But it's because, you know, like autistic children sometimes won't focus on faces because everything's a face, or maybe the face isn't a face, right? There's no distinction there. And sometimes autistic people will tend to focus on the wrong parts of pictures. That's an interesting thing I need to talk about as well. But here, he's focusing on the wrong parts. He's focusing on things like trees and dolls and stoves, but they're talking, you know, and that's what these fairy tales are. And, you know, he's giving them personality, and what he's doing, I would wager, is trying to fit into the world, right? He's below everything. He's kind of like an inanimate object, but he's trying to work his way to where he can fit, so to speak, if that makes any sense. Andersen, I really dearly sympathize with him. I really do. Let me read to you a little bit of my paper here. This kind of implies, I don't use the word autism here, but it implies some thinking about autism that I find useful. Andersen's awkwardness was disjunction to, was discontinuity. Sorry about the bird, by the way, speaking of birds. Andersen's disordered world implied a split between movement and sight. The hand moves, but not where you meant it to. You try to catch a ball, but can't. Dancing becomes tripping and falling. Andersen acted, but not well. He resembled a dancer who leaps, but does not leap intelligently, whose vision and movement relate poorly. After all, touching implies being touched, and I belong to the world I see. I am not just a part from, but a part of the world. I belong to the same world you do. You see differently than I do, yes, but we move together. To realize our togetherness, my sight needs to follow my movement. Eyes and arms should synchronize, dance together. But Andersen was not a dancer. That didn't stop him trying, though, and here's the scene I talked about. When he was 15 years old, he auditioned at the house of Copenhagen ballerina Anna Margrethe Schall, and then there's the quote. Ballet was not Andersen's forte. Dancing requires intelligent movement, proprioception, synchronized limbs, a union of action and awareness, but they were not unified in Andersen. Andersen could not dance because he could not appropriate his experiences. His awareness badly informed his action. His action was therefore immersed in, there's a water image, and dispersed by that awareness. Inundated, another water image, by what he saw, he could not embody the significance of what he saw. Compare this to Kierkegaard's remarks on dancing in his later works. There he depicts the dissociated Andersen's foil, the radically embodied knight of faith. He writes in his famous book Fear and Trembling that it is said that the dancer's hardest task is to leap straight into a definite position, so that not for a second does he have to catch at the position, but stands there in it in the leap itself. Perhaps no dancer can do it, but the knight does it. Here's my writing again. The dancer is her body, She must be. When it moves, she's the one moving, dancing as a practice demands it. In her reflection on these remarks in Fear and Trembling, Kimmerer Lamoth describes the skills a dancer needs. To make a movement, a dancer cannot not coordinate her physical and mental energies and focus them on the task at hand. She exercises that relationship between reason and experience that defines her being in the world. And here's my writing again. This connection between mind and body, between reason and experience, is the synchrony between the flotsam of awareness and its expression in action. Action is utterly individual, happens here and now, lives in the body and its actions, but awareness stands back, looks on from the corner, thinks about what to do more than doing it. A dancer is not a puppet, Kierkegaard says, but Andersen was not a dancer. So I wonder if what Andersen was doing by writing these stories was recovering the synchronization between action and awareness, to be able to move your hand and see that it moves, and to synchronize the sight of the hand and the movement of the hand to attain proprioception, perception of self, perception of one's own movement, the self's movement. And how does he do this? How does he achieve that proprioception by which he would attain what Kierkegaard said he lacked? Because without that synchronization, everything's all over the place in a floatiness. But I wager if his fairy tales were doing that, he was trying to figure out what it's like to, say, be a stove or a tree, right? And to feel himself as a tree, and then work on his own perception of his own body, and discover the swan, so to speak, that he is, to stand on his own 2 feet instead of just the fins, so to speak. So I hope that's encouraging. My name is Christian Swenson. Similar names, don't you think? And I'll be with you next week, hopefully. I want to do an interview with my mom. Tell me how much you would like to see something like that, and I'll see you then. Take care.